Hello, extempers, speech debaters, and everybody else listening to the podcast. I am one of your co-hosts, YuYu.
And I am the other co-host, Spencer.
And today, we're actually kind of following the structure that we have, where every 5 episodes we have a special guest, but y'all have seen Zoey before, so still a very special guest, but a returning special guest, I'll say. If you haven't seen our introduction of Zoey, please go listen to the episode that we did with Zoey. And the only thing I'll update right now is that she is now a 3-time national qualifier in international Extemp. So congratulations to Zoey. But other than that, today we're spilling more tea, okay? Because we're talking about the quote unquote Don't Say Gay bill. That is officially not called the Don't Say Gay bill, but it is what the media has been using. So the majority of you will probably be more familiar with the phrase Don't Say Gay bill. That was passed in Florida. So lots of feelings, lots of emotional connections, but also lots of, legality issues, probably constitutionality issues that all of us are probably going to get into when we move on to the rest of the podcast. But this episode, excited. I don't know about all of you, but excited.
Beforehand, I do think that there's an important topic we got to hit on the table here. We pride ourselves in being a podcast that promotes both sides. And admittedly, everybody here is pretty much against this bill. This is not a bill that anybody here finds favorable. But part of the purpose for what we are here to do is to provide reasons as to maybe why it was thought this way and why the bill was passed in the first place. So for you do the tune out of, oh, it's not what I believe, I'm not going to listen to this, we really ask that you do. Hey, we're going to do our best to promote both sides as appropriate, because this is a pretty big issue and it does need to be discussed. And Zoey being with us is a really good, helpful source, going to help us into really making the most educated and informed decisions on this podcast.
Yeah, I will just add, maybe not promote as a vocab word, but presenting both sides is super important for all of your listeners to know the whole story and to make opinions for themselves. But we will let you know upfront that we have our own personal beliefs and opinions. That is, we don't agree with the bill, we don't support it. But if you are one of those people who don't see the big deal or don't necessarily not support it, I hope you could still listen to this episode, gather some more information, and gather some more knowledge to inform your decision of whether to support the bill or to not support the bill. And if you don't know anything about it, you're in luck, because we're going to tell you about it. So yeah. And then I just want to say, happy Zoey's here. It's the person in the room, they're female, so I'm not alone, and it's not just all men.
All right, without any further ado, we're going to go and dive right into this. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to kind of provide context of the bill. And typically what I do when I look through these bills is I go through and I try to find out how it was worded, the breakdown of the bill, etc. I think most of us can find those sources that explain how that bill is broken down. If you can't, I'll leave a couple. There's a couple good NPR articles that can help address it. Rather, I want to explain the bill more in depth about what actually happened in the process, because it's completely mistaken exactly really what happened. And to a lot of, as I was discussing with us before the podcast, it's actually kind of surprising what occurred with the bill. And when you really look at it from a political science point of view, the bill probably should have died. So Florida, in a lot of ways, passed a bill that shouldn't have ever been passed when you look at how it really broke itself down. The first bill, there were actually 2 bills proposed for the Parental Rights in Education Act. And that's the official name of the bill, the Parental Rights in Education. There were actually two versions of this bill. One was proposed by the House and the other was proposed by the Senate. One failed, the other one was successful, as we know. The bill that failed was Senate Bill 1834, and the bill that passed was House Bill 1557. The Senate bill was proposed in January, really early January. So we know that this bill has been there for a while. It really didn't hit mainstream news until March, when that House bill was gaining a lot of traction, which kind of shocked quite a bit of us in a lot of ways when you look at kind of how that broke down and really the process that occurred with the Senate. One thing to note, the reason why you have sometimes a bill proposed in the House and a bill proposed in the Senate is because if there's a real want for a bill to become passed, they're going to draft two versions of the bill in order for that to occur. So it basically causes this bypass of a failure in one house, which, as we can see, caused the bill to succeed. So drafting two bills gives the bill a higher likelihood of passing through one house to hopefully gain support in the next one in which it failed. And we can see a number of examples of this. A great one is we target a Wyoming audience for the most part. Wyoming did the same thing with banning critical race theory. There were two separate bills proposed in the House and in the Senate. And in essence, both of them did fail in our state. However, we do know that this is usually a concept that's provided to try to gain traction on some bills. So obviously, for a good reason, we're going to focus a lot more on House Bill 1557, which is the one that is passed, and really the kind of the context that that bill has. So this bill was proposed by the Judiciary Committee and the Education and Employment Committee. And when you look at the breakdown, which is provided in the link down in the sources, it was also co-sponsored by a boatload of different representatives. And by a boatload, I mean it was co-sponsored by Avila, Bell, Barrero, Bird, Fernandez, Barquin, Federhoff, Fine, Fisher, Latvala, Maggard, McLean, Placken, Roach, Roth, Cirrus, Snyder, Truenow, and Yarborough. Literally a lot of people were co-sponsored on this bill. I don't know, I will be fair, I don't know if in Florida, if there's a certain number of co-sponsors that can be on a bill. In Wyoming, it is actually limited to 14. So sometimes you have there might be an unlimited amount of people that can be co-sponsored on the bill, which is why you might have so many in this instance for Florida. The act for House Bill 1557 is written as such. It says, quote, it requires district school boards to adopt procedures that comport with certain provisions of law for notifying students' parents of specified information. It requires such procedures to reinforce fundamental right of parents to make decisions regarding upbringing and control of their children, prohibits school district from adopting procedures or student support forms that prohibit school district personnel from notifying parent about specified information, or that encourage students to withhold from parents such information, prohibits school district personnel from discouraging or prohibiting parental notification and involvement in critical decisions affecting students' mental, emotional, or physical well-being. It prohibits classroom discussion about sexual orientation or gender identity in certain grade levels. We know that those certain grade levels are kindergarten through third grade. Requires school districts to notify parents of healthcare services. It authorizes parents to bring action against school district to obtain declaratory judgment. It provides for additional award of injunctive relief, damages, and reasonable attorney fees and court costs to certain parents. That's actually a lot more in depth than the Senate bill version, which is maybe about half of that. So it's even more interesting when you go into consider that the Senate bill failed, because if the Senate bill was a lot more concise, it also meant that it was probably a bit more lenient. And typically those bills tend to do better, even if we have more polarization per se. So once again, kind of makes it very interesting that this kind of bill passed in a lot of ways. When you look through the process, House Bill 1557 had 14 amendments to the bill in the Florida House. 13 of those amendments were either withdrawn or had failed, and the House ultimately passed the bill on a 69-47 vote. So it passed pretty favorably in the House. When it went to the House, it had to pass through two different committees. It obviously passed through the Education and Employment Committee first, and then it went through the Judiciary Committee. However, when it went to the Senate, it was sent to the Appropriations Committee. The Appropriations Committee in states and at the national level is a committee that deals with funding and finance. Okay, so usually your state budget is proposed by the Appropriations Committee. And oftentimes it ends up being the second committee that bills go to if they're dealing with money. Obviously, this is a bill that's not dealing with money. So why it went to the Appropriations Committee, I don't know. It's and that's usually where we go, wait, this got sent to a different committee. That's usually a sign that a bill is going to die. And when you look at the Senate bill version of it, the Senate bill went to the Appropriations Committee in the Senate and died in that committee because admittedly, they didn't want this bill to succeed. So this is the same committee that caused the Senate bill to die. But it passed, and it passed very narrowly. It passed on a 12-8 vote, and it sent it to the floor for debate in the Senate, in which every amendment to the bill had ultimately failed. And then the Senate voted to pass the bill on a 22-17 vote and was sent to Governor Ron DeSantis, in which it was signed into law on March 28th of 2022. And the note is that the Senate bill failed on February 8th of 2022. So when you really look at how this breaks down, it's quite surprising that this bill actually passed. In every way that we know how bills usually go through Congress, if it's being sent to a committee that has nothing to deal with that bill, usually what happens is the Speaker of the House or the President is causing that bill to die. In the instance of the Senate typically has what's called a president. Obviously, at the national level, we know it as the vice president. But the president appointed this to a committee that they basically wanted the bill to die. And that really goes to show why this bill being passed is quite a surprise from like more of a governmental level. And reasonably speaking, I mean, was this bill going to get signing from Governor DeSantis? Of course it was. Governor DeSantis is Governor DeSantis, right? But reasonably speaking, this bill actually should have died. It really didn't have a lot of support. It didn't have a lot of votes to gain it momentum in the Senate. So if Florida is to turn blue, whether that be 2022, 2024, or whenever down the road, this is a bill that's likely to become repealed because it really doesn't have that traction to allow the bill to stay in place for a long time. So whether or not we talk about its constitutionality, if it is upheld for some reason under the Constitution, there will certainly be a time that this bill will probably become repealed because of its narrow margins of how it passed through the Senate. And that brings us to Zoey, who is going to provide us with some very interesting insight on the bill's impact, what we're going to see when it becomes enacted in July, and ultimately kind of like the LGBTQ response.
Yeah, so I think of course, the controversial part of the bill is that there can be no classroom discussions about sexual orientation or gender identity in certain grade levels. But most of the bill is talking about parental rights in education. I mean, that's the name of the bill. And so, first, I honestly think that the most harmful part of the bill is the parental rights in education because it really gives parents a lot of support from the government when it comes to going against the school district. And so I've seen a lot of teachers in Florida that are in same-sex marriages, and they can't have a picture of them and their spouse on their desk because if a parent were to come in and see that, they could possibly complain, and then that teacher could possibly get fired under this bill. And so we see that the bill itself, I'll get into the my own personal opinions about what this bill is actually going to do. But I think that the most harmful part is that it's very vague and that it gives a lot of power to parents. And so that really means that it could affect the school districts in Florida in a lot of different ways. And so I think that that's something we can't really give an example or give an exact impact because, like I said, it could really be in any way. But of course, the most controversial part is the discussion of sexual orientation and gender identity. And the GLAAD president actually talking about this, and she said, "We are creating a solution to a problem that doesn't exist." And I could not agree more. I don't think that this bill is actually going to change much because when this bill is enacted, that just means, especially just talking about this one sentence, that there can be no longer any conversations around the LGBTQ community. But that wasn't happening anyways. It wasn't happening in Florida, definitely wasn't happening in Wyoming. And when we actually look at the statistics, we see that most students have not had education on LGBTQ issues. The Trevor Project says that only 28% of middle school and high school LGBTQ students reported that they have ever learned about LGBTQ people or issues in their classes at all. And so we see only 28% of people nationwide have ever had a lesson on it. And I personally, there's never been a lesson for me that has been around LGBTQ people. We have talked about things that have affected LGBTQ people, that we have kind of talked about the impact a little bit, but that's in all of my schooling. Definitely not before third grade were we ever having these conversations. And so honestly, this bill is very controversial, but it really isn't going to do much. I truly think that where the bill is harmful is giving those parental rights in education and not really with the harm to the LGBTQ community. Because I am a part of the community myself, and I wasn't taught about anything. And there was even a class in my middle school called life skills where we were supposed to talk about these things, and there was zero mention of anything to do with queerness. And so I listed some things that I thought were true when I was younger because I had no education on it. Keep in mind, I come from a very accepting family and, my friends and everything. And so it's not that education wasn't being withheld from me, but just because I wasn't specifically taught things in school, this is the stuff that I thought. I thought that being gay was a disability and that it was not normal. I thought that gay people could not run for public office because I couldn't really name anyone that had ran for public office not because they were gay, but that were gay. I thought that lesbians could not get STDs. That one is very bad. I thought that talking about queerness was inappropriate because it's directly tied to sexuality and sexual expression, and that's not something that's appropriate. And that is really especially directly tied to this bill. When we see the people within Florida, the civilians that were advocating for this bill, we saw that one of the main reasons they didn't want to pass, or they wanted to pass this bill, was because they thought that discussions around sexual identity were too explicit for children. But that directly ties someone's full identity to just the actual sexuality part of, sexual identity and gender identity, which that's not all of it. And so I think that thought that I had where it's inappropriate to talk about it because, you don't talk about sex in public is directly because of mindsets like this that actually got the bill passed. I thought that if I wanted to live the life that I wanted and have a career and stuff, I had to live my life as straight because I thought if you are queer, that's your full identity and you can't really have anything else. And so clearly it's important that we have queer education in schools, but there's no queer education. And so this bill really isn't going to affect much. But we see that what this bill does do is it specifically puts wording that talking about the LGBTQ community is bad and it's inappropriate. And that precedent by itself that this bill is setting, but honestly that already exists, is harmful. And so we can see some direct statistics about when we are putting a negative connotation towards the community. So the Wisconsin LGBTQ Center says that 84% of LGBT youth were verbally harassed at schools because of their gender identity or sexual orientation. 74% of transgender youth reported sexual harassment at school based on their gender identity or expression. 25% of LGBT students have been physically hurt by another student. 55% of transgender youth reported physical attacks based on their gender identity, and 28% of LGBT youth dropped out of school because of this harassment. So when we aren't specifically educating people on queerness in schools, or we're just directly not talking about it at all, that allows for this violence to occur at schools. Additionally, Stonewall.org says that 48% of people have heard no positive messaging about LGBTQ plus in schools in the last year. However, people that did receive positive messages had a reduced suicidal thoughts and feelings, regardless if they were LGBTQ or not. Almost all teachers, 96% in secondary schools and 91% in primary schools, who have addressed lesbian, gay, or bisexual issues or different family issues received no complaints from parents. And so that one's really important too. This is not an issue for most people. It's an issue for a very small amount of people that were so outspoken that this bill was able to pass, like Spencer said. And again, from the Trevor Project, when students do learn about LGBTQ issues, they feel more represented and their anxiety and depression rates fall. They're also less likely to drop out of schools. And so we see that even though this bill isn't changing anything because we aren't having these conversations in school, especially that young, that doesn't mean that we shouldn't have that education. It's very important that we do, because we will see a direct impact on how people feel in schools. But I think overall, this bill, honestly, I didn't really bother looking into it that much when it first passed, because I didn't think it was that out of the ordinary. I knew that it was a super controversial bill, and I think the reason why it's so controversial is because people think that stuff like this can't still happen. People think that this is something that maybe could have passed in the 80s or, the 90s or even the early 2000s, but there's no way it could have passed now. But as someone who is directly affected by legislation like this, stuff like this happens all the time. And it's not really out of the ordinary. And so I think if you aren't directly affected by it, you probably think it's a bigger deal and more controversial than it actually is. Because, for example, my school last June, there was people putting up pride flags and putting up Love is Love posters. And my school administration decided that it was so much of a distraction that they made teachers take down all the pride flags and all the Love is Love posters. And there were students that were being threatened. There was queer students that were being threatened, and they were not punished. And so my school just outright said, you cannot talk about your sexuality whatsoever. You cannot have any pride flags or anything. You can't hang them up, and you can't have any Love is Love posters or anything supporting the community at all in the school, because it's too much of a distraction. I would personally argue that that's a little bit worse than this. And so I think but that honestly could have gone unnoticed if you weren't personally affected by it. And so I think that this bill by itself is very controversial, even though it's not really going to change much and not out of the ordinary. I think stuff like this happens a lot. But that doesn't mean that we shouldn't have education in schools, that we shouldn't be talking about these issues, because that is very important. And thankfully, we have seen a lot of protests in Florida of this bill. And as Spencer said before, it's possible that if Florida could turn and maybe like the next decade, that this bill could possibly be repealed. So overall, education is good. And I think that a lot of the rhetoric around this bill and the reason why it was passed, and even why Ron DeSantis himself said that it was passed, is because parents need a lot of say in schools. But as I already mentioned, because it really gives most of the power to parents themselves, it's possible that could be harmful, that could be the most harmful part of the bill. So that's basically all of the impact I think is going to happen because of the bill. But if either of you have something to add, go ahead.
Yeah, I think that's all great. What Spencer gives with the contextualization of the bill, and what Zoey tells about the actual effects of the bill on schools in Florida, especially elementary schools in Florida, is all very important information that we should all know about. I do want to stress the importance of something that Zoey said, in that this is not something that is controversial in itself, because this type of behavior, this type of rhetoric, it happens everywhere without the need for a bill. But the scary part and the most controversial part is when it is written into law And it feels like because it's written into law, people feel an obligation to follow the law. And when people disagree with the law, they're obviously going to have a lot of hate or a lot of like emotions and feelings towards this particular law because it affects their community, or it's just a bad law in general because it just affects everybody else, or it affects people's freedoms or their freedom of expression of themselves. And that is where the controversy has been generated from. But I think that leads us very well into our question today by Extemp Central. The question that we're going to answer is, what impact will Florida's Don't Say Gay bill have on the state's education system? So Zoe, if you want to elaborate on some more of your points, we would love to have you start first.
Okay, yeah. So as I already said, I don't think that most of the impact of this bill is going to have to do with the representation of LGBTQ people, because that's not really something that's being talked about right now. And so I think most of the impact that it's going to have on the state education system is that the government is really no longer in support of the education system, because this bill allows students, or allows teachers and parents to, mostly parents, to complain to the government about things that the school district is teaching. And there could be a lot of punishments for the actual school district itself. And so the example that I gave before is if there was a gay teacher who was in a same-sex marriage, they couldn't really put a picture of themselves on their desk with their spouse, because if a parent were to come in, it's possible that that teacher could be punished and possibly be fired. And so I think that I gave, during finals at districts, I gave a speech about the book bans. And I think that this is actually going to have a pretty similar effect and impact on school districts as the book bans, because we're putting good and bad labels on education, on things that we're learning about. We are saying, yes, you can learn about this. No, you cannot learn about this. And I think the real question that this bill opens us up to is that something for us to really say? Is there good things to learn about and bad things to learn about? And especially, who has that power to decide? Is it parents, or is it the government, or is it the teachers, or is it the school district, right? Who has that power? And I think that one of the most shocking things about this bill is that it's saying, yes, we should put a good and bad label on basically lessons, and we should give that power to parents. And so I think that that's most of the impact that it's going to have on the education system. And as I said before, I already named some statistics that I think would be good to share in an Extemp speech. If you do want to talk about the impact that it's going to have on LGBTQ students, it's not really going to impact them much, but we see that when we do educate people on queer issues and LGBTQ issues, we see that people are less likely to drop out. There's lower rates of anxiety and depression, regardless if they're part of the community. So that's basically what I would talk about.
I'll hit on something that I think is going to be interesting in this discussion. So I remember taking a class a while back. I don't remember if it was, it was a sociology class. I can't remember which one it was. But there was a really good discussion about education in this course, and really about kind of the impact of why a lack of education on some issues can be dangerous. And one of the points that we were discussing, really, and this is maybe not the best comparison, but one of the discussions we were talking about was things like domestic violence at home, right? Because what happens is sometimes this kind of conversation is needed when children come into school every day, having experienced this continuously in their life, and having this like impact of like nobody, like they might come in with like kind of in this like weird funk, but it's just normal to them, right? And not being able to have something like available for you can actually impact like counseling. And that's one of the really big things that I think is really important here. Is, like I said, probably not my best comparison that I've got here, but me just thinking out loud, I think that the impact here that can really be hard is kind of understanding that, as Zoe was mentioning, pointing out the statistics, understanding like the concept of sexual orientation, right? And being able to almost in essence like talk about that issue can help to kind of expose that problem, not that problem, but the idea and knowledge of it now, right? Especially at these young, especially at these young ages, right? Where a lot of this can be seen at early stages, especially kindergarten through third grade. We know that this is a time where this can really start to become apparent, right? And that is a conversation that needs to be that needs to happen, right? And that is something that needs to be made available. I said maybe not my best comparison, but I think that in a lot of ways, understanding and teaching about these issues can really lead to a effect that can be good in the long run. It should be noted that it's got to be taught maybe earlier and really kind of starting to explain what's going on. I think the other impact that's here, this is definitely a more important impact I see here, or both of these are important impacts. This one in particular is, we've talked about this in a previous podcast, YuYu, where you have teachers going into school board meetings, right? And they are literally spouting fire, and causing a lot of problems right now. And one of the things that I read when we were breaking down what the act entirely says is that this can be done at the school board meetings. Aren't we just escalating the fire that already exists? And trust me, like, I know you want the schools to have like a certain way to educate people, right? I mean, we've been doing this forever now. Like, we can date this back. Well, we just had this conversation a couple weeks ago, YuYu, where talking about like No Child Left Behind Act really just already screwed the entire education system to already teach to certain standards, right? And then you're adding more and more on that to what is being limited and taught in the K through 12 education system. I just feel like overall this bill, from our discussion, or from what Zoe has stated and kind of the discussion we're having now, I feel like that it's only causing the limits to what can be taught to increase. And I think that there is a significant problem with that. While it's not already happening, and it should be happening, limiting this is not a good idea. And we should start to have conversations about these issues. I don't know, YuYu.
I'm guessing that's a transition to me, but yeah, I agree with many of the points that both Spencer and Zoe has brought up in terms of how this is going to affect the education system. I want to also say that I'm like interested in both the legality side of this and also interested in how it affects society because of those legality issues. And so I can first start off by saying that I think what this bill does, if it stays or if it doesn't go to like the courts to decide constitutionality or whatever, then it means that it is something legal. It is there. It is legally there. The precedent has been set. The danger is in setting that precedent, because right now the bill may cover only K through 3 education, but that doesn't mean that it won't spread to higher levels of education, because when precedents are set, it is usually those precedents that will be used to justify more like censorship on what you can teach in schools. It is how the law, it is how people who want to push a certain agenda uses the legal system, like the way that it is set up to determine like constitutionality, to determine what laws that they can pass to their favor. And so that is like what I'm really interested in. But as the bill in itself, because it exists as a bill and no one seems to be, or like no one in a position of power seems to like take that down, then it makes it in a sense kind of permanent. And the way that that affects how society views things is obviously, we as a society view laws as very important, view these things that are like written bills as something to be followed. And so when they are written in this way, society tends to usually follow it in this way. And how that manifests is in the parents' ability to sue teachers if they're bringing up things like sexual orientation, if they're bringing up things like the LGBTQ plus community. And that is scary. It creates a chilling effect among teachers. It basically makes them feel like that they have to censor themselves. They have to be careful about what they say. And for LGBTQ plus teachers, it makes it even worse, because then they can't really express themselves when they're teaching. They can't like advocate for things that they feel are more important. And even if students are like talking amongst themselves and have very controversial views about the LGBTQ plus community, that teacher like can't say anything because they would get sued in that situation. And this is like part of the chilling effect that I read about in multiple articles, is that yes, while it seems like parents have more say, I'm going to stress one of Zoey's points that that could be a bad thing, because then teachers can't teach. They can't say what they sometimes have to say, or they don't have the freedom anymore to be able to teach kids things that they should know about and to shape these kids to be the future generation. And so what it does to the education system is both constricts it, but also shapes the next generation to be a generation of either ignorance or hate. And that's something that we should all keep in mind, regardless of your views of whether you support LGBTQ plus members or not. This is what it does to the education system when we limit a certain thing that is being taught, especially when it's something that furthers social acceptance and like positive change. But overall, I think that's all I have to say to it. And those are like my thoughts, what I would give as an answer if I were to give this as an Extemp speech.
I kind of want to add something else too. So the only part where it talks about K-3 is specifically the sexual orientation and gender identity, which means that the rest of the bill applies to everyone. And that's really scary, because even when you aren't talking about those things specifically, there's other things that can be viewed as explicit that you're talking about in classroom settings that teachers can potentially complain about. Like, for example, this year I'm a senior, and so we're all like 17 and 18, but we read The Rape of Nanking in my history class, which is a book about it's called like the forgotten Holocaust, and it's an extremely explicit book about the horrible things that the Japanese soldiers were doing to the citizens of Nanking, China. It has really graphic pictures, it has really graphic imagery, and even though I'm mature and I knew that I needed to learn about it, I still considered it very hard to read. And it's possible that a parent could have complained about that. And even though it was hard to read, it's still so valuable that people get education from things that might not be comfortable. And so even if it isn't about, sexual orientation or gender identity, it's still possible that parents can complain about things like reading the books like The Rape of Nanking. Or, there's other examples of even just like in my history class, we've watched some videos that could be kind of disturbing. And I think that this bill kind of, like you was saying, like sets a precedent where like parents can decide what is learned and what isn't learned just based on how explicit it is. And I know that that's the idea around the bill, is that parents were saying we should be able to choose what our students are learning about, and they shouldn't be learning about these things. It's horrible. They shouldn't be learning about these things in schools, but they should be, even if it is disturbing and even if it is explicit, that doesn't mean that they shouldn't be learning it. And so I think that even if we just totally disregard that whole part of the bill, I think that the fact that most of the bill pertains to everybody that's in the education system of Florida is pretty disturbing as well. That's it.
Let's kind of jog off of this point and kind of almost spin it in a different way. Okay. What I know from sociology classes, the people that do the most complaining to schools are middle-class moms. They do a ton of this. Okay? Something that is just not right in school, the principal usually gets that long-winded phone call, right? And it's doesn't usually end well with the principal. Okay? May or may not have a couple of real life experiences with that one. Okay? But admittedly, that is what does happen, right? Which kind of begs some interesting questions I think that proposes with this topic. And that is, this is a group of people that we know is going to still do this. Okay, whether this bill didn't pass, it was probably still going to be a group of people that were going to do this nonetheless. And it does create some kind of results. And not necessarily, maybe it does become into what is taught or what is explained, but I guess the question really becomes like, where do these groups of people really land with this change in this bill and what gets explained and taught in schools, right? Is this going to see that same group, or are we going to start seeing a more vast group? I would almost take this gander that I would think it would remain being the same group, and that if that's true, there would really be no, like Zoe was saying earlier, there would be no effect, right, on the discussion of this, which would be still unfortunate, still something that needs to be taught, right? But as a result of this, if this is just the same group that continues to express this and say, you're not teaching my kid what, hey, you would probably get the same end result here. So I don't know where we want to go with that thought. Also, kind of jumping back to YuYu's point here a moment ago, kind of about like what the challenges are going to be on this. I believe this bill is similar to that of the abortion law in Texas, in which you have to do this by lawsuit. And if that is the case, this is going to be very difficult to get to the Supreme Court, which means that it is very difficult for this to become overturned in every way, shape, and form. And ultimately, a big challenge if you really want to show that this is an unconstitutional bill. But I don't exactly remember if it's a lawsuit or not. It probably is, because that's the path that bills are going to help stop them from being proven as unconstitutional, especially after what we have seen in Texas with that specific.
Yeah. And like further off of that, because it's done through like individualized lawsuits towards certain aspects of the school or certain people, a part of the school, those court decisions will get to decide like what is considered sexual orientation conversations, what is considered something that is too explicit to be taught in these particular grades or to these particular children. And that can cascade into a multitude of things. So hopefully this bill will be repealed, maybe in the near future, maybe not. But currently, this is the situation that's happening in Florida. This is our reality, and it's something that highlights the reality that all of us have been living in, and like Zoe has been experiencing her whole life. So if no one has any more else to add, I can conclude this episode. All right, so lots of great things to take away from this episode. Even if you don't agree with most of our opinions, I think it's just something to inform yourselves of, you know, new perspectives and new things and like new things to think about. But I hope you get the one in the round. And if you don't, let us know how you did. Let us know how we did. Like DM us. We're usually up maybe at 3 a.m. Well, I don't know about Zoe, but like Spencer and I are up usually at 3 a.m. Yeah, so feel free to DM us at our Instagram. That's linked somewhere around the video or in the description. All of us are available there. Don't forget to hit the subscribe button so that you are subscribed, and hit the notification bell so that you get notifications for when episodes come out, because they come out early on our YouTube rather than on OneClap. So like if you want exclusive content, well, not exclusive, early content, ring the bell. All right. Follow us on our social media. It's at the Half Hour Extemp podcast for both Twitter and Instagram. We do polls there. We ask Q&As there. It's great. It's a fun time. You should totally check it out. But yeah, if anything else, I think this is a pretty good episode. Thank you for listening. Thank you for watching. Thank you for supporting us. Until next time, it's usually what Spencer says. I will let him say that.
Thanks for stealing my outro. Thank you all so much for watching. And until next time, we will see you all.